Hi everyone, and welcome to the second part of the PowerPoint for Module 9. So here I'm talking about Chapter 11, which is on emotion and stress. This is one of my favorite chapters because it's where I really get to start to talk about clinical psychology and my main area of interest, which is how stress and trauma impacts us long term. So before we get into the specifics of, what I mean when I say stress and what I mean in terms of how it can impact us, I want to start by just talking about emotions generally. And this is something that I used to talk to my patients about when I did clinical service, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions about, and I'm going to use air quotes here, positive and negative emotions. I think we really think about things like happiness and joy as being like positive emotions, and sadness and grief and anger as being negative emotions. But I think that really creates this misconception that we should be happy most of the time. And in actuality, that is not the case. We really should not set ourselves up for the expectation that we're happy most of the time, and then feel guilt or shame or disappointment when we experience, again, what we're kind of terming more negative emotions. In actuality, all emotions are extremely important for survival. All emotions should be part of our everyday life. And so when we're talking about emotions, we're really talking about a lot of different aspects of experiencing feelings. I think the parts that get most overlooked are the physiological changes. So things happen in our brain, as we're going to talk about. There are hormonal changes when we experience certain things like fear. There's cognitive processes behind it. So there's typically a thought. So what most people don't realize is emotions don't just kind of pop up out of nowhere. They're not these just like objective, concrete things. They're abstract experiences that follow a thought. So think about back in the day when maybe you used to walk on campus, or if you're a first year student, maybe back in high school, you used to walk into the lunchroom. You'd walk in the lunchroom and maybe you see your friends sitting at a table and you get super excited and you wave to them and you're going to go get your food and go sit with them. But as soon as you wave to them and they see you, they all look at each other and they laugh. So most of us are going to have the thought, wow, my friends might be making fun of me, right? There's a thought, it's an appraisal. You're appraising the situation, which then leads to an emotion, which might be sadness or anger. Whereas if the thought was different, maybe the thought is something like, oh, I bet my friend Andy just told a funny joke. I can't wait to get over there and hear it myself. Well, that's a different appraisal of the same situation. So it's important to realize that the way that we cognitively explain the thought that we have about a particular event or incident or situation, that's what actually leads to the emotion. We have action tendencies, which are essentially the behavioral outcomes. Like what do we do when we have that feeling? Do you run towards your friends because you can't wait to hear the funny story, or do you run away from your friends because you think they made fun of you? There's also a ton of cultural norms and regulations around how appropriate it is to experience or express certain emotions given certain situations. We're not going to spend a ton of time talking about the cultural norms. I wish we could, but again, we're having to cut some material out just to make sure we can cover everything we need to cover and not get too overwhelmed each week. But when we're talking about emotion, we need to realize that there's multiple ways we communicate how we feel to other people. The most obvious is verbal, right? I feel sad. By saying that, I have verbally communicated in a fairly concise and straightforward way how I'm feeling. But in actuality, we get a ton of information from nonverbal communication. And the possibilities of how we do that, our kind of options or approaches for nonverbal communication are quite extensive. I think the most obvious is facial expressions. We get so much information from facial expressions. I think it's interesting that we spend so little time thinking about that in day-to-day life. Think about if, you were, I don't know, doing a performance in front of people and all of them were sitting there with their arms crossed, maybe like fidgeting. But if they were sitting there smiling, the smile would probably, I would say, hopefully help you feel like they're listening and they're interested. The facial expression is really the thing that's going to sell us on how somebody's feeling. So facial expressions reflect how we feel, but the thing that most people don't realize is it also influences how we feel. So we call that facial feedback. So it's not just about sharing kind of our inner emotional experiences with others, it actually influences the person themselves. And your book does a really nice job of kind of talking about some of that research, so I won't belabor that point, but I do want to really emphasize how important nonverbal communication is in terms of emotional experiences. So when we're talking about emotions, as I kind of alluded to a moment ago, we really have to kind of start with the biology to understand what's happening within us in terms of experiencing emotions and feelings. So the amygdala is one of the first places we need to stop in the body, specifically in the brain. So the amygdala is going to do that initial evaluation of any emotional incoming information. So it's receiving a ton of sensory information nonstop, as we've been talking about all semester long. And the amygdala is going to be responsible for trying to determine what is actually of importance, especially emotional importance. And so, if you're backpacking with me and we're out walking on a trail and we think we see something move in the woods, your amygdala is going to take the sensory information that's coming in and is going to try to determine, is that a bear, right? It might come to that initial preliminary decision that it's a bear, we need to do something. But the good part is, or the good news is that there's this other part of our brain that I'm going to kind of call the smarter part of our brain. Our amygdala is going to be really reactive, and it's going to do kind of a quick and dirty job of making that initial evaluation. And that makes sense because we want it operating quickly, because if it's a bear, we need to know now. The cerebral cortex, on the other hand, is a little bit more in the front of the brain, more like the forehead, especially if we're talking prefrontal, is very much the front of the forehead. So that is going to bring more rational reasoning parts of our brain online. That's why I say the smarter part of our brain. The smarter part of our brain is going to come online and say, okay, let's really look at all the information. The dark thing you saw moving in the woods is actually your friend wearing a ridiculously large down coat because it's cold. I don't think we need to run. We're not in any danger. So the cerebral cortex can come online and actually override that amygdala's quick and dirty initial appraisal of the situation. So both areas of the brain are going to be important for helping us kind of appraise and determine, using that sensory information, what's emotionally relevant or emotionally important. There's lots of other parts of biology that need to be kind of recognized here and talked about. Another is mirror neurons, which are brain cells that essentially fire when we're observing somebody else do something. And the reason they're called mirror neurons is the firing in our brain essentially mirrors what that person's brain is doing. It's not exact because we're just an observer. We're not actually experiencing or doing the thing. But because our brain is going to fire in a way that's kind of going to mimic that other person, what we can actually get is a greater sense of empathy. And so this is why when you see somebody else experiencing something, we can often feel it so deeply. Watching somebody else cry often makes many of us cry. Without even really knowing what they're upset about, we often feel that sense of dread. It's another explanation or another reason that, mirror neurons kind of pop up in every day would be if you ever see somebody get hurt. And I think of this a lot in the fall because, I watch a lot of football. And so I, this past week or so, was watching Alex Smith. If you all know who he was an NFL player that was seriously hurt 2 years ago, really, really bad leg injury, and he is now back playing. So if you want to see a horrific sports accident, go to YouTube and Google Alex Smith injury. Watching his leg do that gruesome, gross, unnatural bend, it will make you feel sick. Your leg will hurt. And the reason that is because of the mirror neurons that we're talking about here. The autonomic nervous system is also extremely relevant. Remember, we talked about the sympathetic and parasympathetic sympathetic branches. We'll talk more about that in a moment when we talk about stress. But essentially, the sympathetic nervous system is going to come online when we detect a threat, and is going to tell the adrenal glands to release two hormones, epinephrine, norepinephrine, which essentially helps us become more alert or full of energy, which we can then respond to any potential threats. So, kind of circling back to the example I gave of you walking into the dining hall, emotions are not kind of automatically attached to events. This is all about how we perceive events. So think about, and maybe this is hard to think of right now because many of us are pretty socially isolated because of the pandemic, but think about the last time you went and did something with a friend. You went on a vacation or you engaged in an activity. And think about whether you perceived and experienced that event exactly the same way. So I'm thinking about the last backpacking trip I took with some friends. And if you were to ask me, what I thought about that trip, I would have talked about how my feet got wet because we went through this horrible bog and the water was up over my boots. I would have talked about how I didn't sleep very well that night because it was kind of windy and I don't know, I kept thinking I heard something. I would talk about how hilly the trail was and it just wasn't, it wasn't my favorite hike, if I can be honest. Whereas if you were to ask my wife, she would talk about the nice weather. She would talk about the tasty food I packed for us, how it was fun to get outside and to push herself physically. We did the exact same hike, and for whatever reason, my appraisal was more negative after that trip than hers was. Why? Probably a lot of different things, right? Maybe some of my expectations maybe set me up for failure. Maybe she's in better shape than me right now. There's a lot of different reasons, but essentially we had the exact same experience, but had very different emotional reactions because we appraised it differently. I also want to at least mention that appraisals and what we know about the role of appraisals and emotions extend beyond just this chapter. So, for example, the field of clinical psychology very much relies on appraisals to help individuals with particular psychological disorders. So if you've ever been in therapy, you probably noticed that your therapist will often ask you to reconsider or reappraise something that happened. And the reason we do that is a lot of people with psychological disorders like depression and anxiety often misappraise things. So, for example, someone with an anxiety disorder may assume that a bad thing is very likely to happen when in actuality it's not a very likely outcome. And so the therapist might kind of push them on that and ask them to reconsider or think about the likelihood of the event, which then, once they realize it's an unlikely outcome or unlikely event, would actually reduce their anxiety. So actually, a lot of what we do in the field of clinical psychology involves appraisals. So for example, cognitive therapy, that shouldn't surprise you, that's actually dealing with appraisals, which are thoughts or cognitions. So lots of applications of this material, even outside of just kind of the basic understanding of how thoughts and emotions impact other aspects of our life. So again, in this situation, psychological disorders.